Hey guys, it's Miss Rhodes again. Now we're going to talk about the second unit in English 3, and it is entitled Reason and Revolution, and it covers the period between 1750 and 1800. These notes will begin on page 49 of your textbook, and the notes begin that on April the 19th, 1775, a group of American Minutemen faced British redcoats across the little bridge outside the village of Concord, Massachusetts. Suddenly, someone, no one knows who, fired a musket shot. The shot heard round the world, and the American Revolution began. That shot was the climax of years of frustration, anger, and preparation among the colonists. During the half-century before the Revolution, the 13 colonies had begun to prosper and to seem less and less like perilous settlements on the edge of the wilderness. They had begun to communicate more with one another, and they had grown aware of their mutual problems and feelings. They shared their anger over the oppressive political and economic policies of the British government. No one at that time, however, was thinking of revolution. Not yet. Then came a series of infuriating laws and taxes. The Stamp Act in 1765 required that the colonists buy special stamps for newspapers, licenses, pamphlets, and other documents. The Quartering Act in 1765 was to feed and house British soldiers in their own homes. The Townshend Acts in 1767 taxed tea, glass, lead, and paper. When some of the colonial assemblies refused to abide by the new laws, the British government declared these assemblies dissolved. Violence was not far away. The Boston Massacre erupted in 1770 when British troops fired on a taunting mob. In 1773, the British Parliament insisted again on its right and power to tax America. The tax on the tea became a symbol, and the famous Boston Tea Party became a symbol too, a symbol of the American resistance, as colonists dressed as Indians dumped a shipment of British tea into the Boston harbor. Americans protested and petitioned King George III for no taxation without representation. They wanted only what was reasonable, they said. They wanted a share in their own government. Britain replied with the Intolerable Acts of 1774, designed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. Many more rights that had been charters were revoked. Then, when Paul Revere spotted the redcoats on their way to seize American arms at Concord, Americans responded with force. Yet it was not until January 1776 that a widely heard public voice demanded complete separation from England. The voice was that of Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense, with its heated language, increased the growing demand for separation. It pointed the way toward the Declaration of Independence in July. If ever writing affected public affairs, Common Sense did. We will not be surprised to find that most American literature in the 18th century was political. Through newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, broadsides, and letters, colonial leaders discussed their ideas of human nature and of government. They began forging a new sense of a national identity. Battles had to be fought before the 13th colonies achieved independence. Nevertheless, for years before the first shot was fired, language was the source of the growing American power. For those Americans, it was language that connected reason and revolution. By the time the Revolutionary War was over in 1783, Americans were well on their way to establishing a literature that was extraordinary. Thomas Jefferson once said that a rational society is one that informs the mind, sweetens the temper, cheers our spirits, and promotes health. Jefferson's attitudes, a firm belief in progress, common sense, and the pursuit of happiness, is typical of a period we now call the Age of Reason. Some historians say we oversimplify the complex 18th century in suggesting that it was a time when everyone was reasonable. Of course, everyone was not reasonable. The century was marked by fiery emotion as much as by cool logic. But it was a time when people believed in the possibilities of reason. It is that hope, that optimism, that gives the age its character. Americans at this time were influenced by the European movement known as the Enlightenment. Followers of the Enlightenment believed that people could discover truth by the light of reason alone. They shed the light of reason on the darkness of ignorance, superstition, social injustice, and public tyranny, all in a quest to build the perfect society. Through science and rational government, they thought order could be established in the world. Above all, followers of the Enlightenment ideas stressed the importance of resisting arbitrary limitations on their own free thoughts. Enlightened Americans, like Europeans, came to trust in human potential. They began to rely on the power of their own minds to shape their own destinies, and the power of their own language to express what that destiny should be. They thought, wrote, and spoke with a greater self-confidence than a young nation had ever done before. Jefferson once commented that one evening spent at Ben Franklin's house in Philadelphia, in the company of musicians, lawyers, and politicians, was worth a whole week in Paris. During the 1770s, no one in America could claim to be a professional novelist, poet, or playwright. Yet a great number of Americans expressed themselves on the subjects of liberty, government, law, reason, and the like. Throughout the land, weekly poets' corners in American newspapers never lacked logically written poems and songs. Americans filled pamphlets with anonymous poems on the issues of the day, and they produced a lot of broadsides, which are sheets of paper covered with anonymous poems, songs, and essays that could be tacked up around the city, left on doorsteps, or even read to groups on street corners. The writing was not sophisticated, but it was the writing of the people whose lives were touched by these influences. The policies of Great Britain helped make great writers of these people. Furor over the Stamp Act of 1765 brought out poems everywhere, in political pamphlets, newspapers, nailed to trees, slipped under doors. And when Boston soldiers killed several Boston citizens in 1770, a flurry of broadsides protested the senseless deaths. The awkward, naive verses, written by people who were not professional writers, suggest that the pain and shock of the events were intense enough to stir, even in non-literary people, the need to express their feelings. Gradually, negative protests turned into more positive expressions. Besides for petitioning against taxation without representation, more and more Americans started calling for self-government. Paine's pamphlet, called Common Sense, sold an extraordinary 100,000 copies in 3 months. The Declaration of Independence, the culmination of the writing of this period, carries the voice not of an individual but of a whole people. It is more than the writing of the period. It defined the meaning of revolution. One of the well-known poets from that time was Philip Freneau. Philip Freneau wrote bitter satires and fiery political poems, earning the title Poet of the American Revolution. The first writer in this unit is Ben Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston. He was the son of a poor craftsman who could not afford to keep Ben in school. So Ben educated himself by reading. As a teenager, he learned the printing trade and published his first essay in his brother's newspaper. He was proud, ambitious, and independent, and he left Boston at the age of 17, arriving penniless in Philadelphia. He soon established himself as a printer and a civic leader. He became rich and was able to retire from business at the age of 42. Ben Franklin intended to devote the rest of his life to science, the only thing, it was said, about which he was not ironic. His work on lightning rods, earthquakes, bifocal lenses, and electricity made him world famous, and the Franklin stove is still used in some homes. Within the text, I think Franklin is probably the best example of what we call the new American. He was clever, prudent, and self-made. He was thrifty, he worked hard, and knew how to take advantage of an opportunity. He knew how to get ahead. He had energy, curiosity, tact, charm, and practicality that helped him become successful in business, literature, science, and government. In the first section that we're going to read of Franklin's, we will study quite a number of aphorisms. Aphorisms are known for, are short sayings memorable for their wit and their wisdom, some of which are on page 57 in your textbook. The next thing that we're going to read is Ben Franklin's autobiography, or at least a small section of it. And one of the most interesting things, I think, would be Ben Franklin's attempt at moral perfection, something for which we all strive, But Ben Franklin went about it in a way that he thought that within 13 weeks he would be able to find a way to make himself morally perfect. And so he made a list of 13 vices that people commit that he was guilty of, and then he sort of watched every day how he was going to try to eliminate these vices from his character. And he thought that if he could master one of these vices a week and take control over it, that the rest would sort of take care of themselves. But he found in the long run that he was not able to become a perfect person. And the thing with which he had the most trouble, the vice with which he had the most trouble, was order. And if you look at his list there of how he spends his day, it might give you an example of why. He had a very strict idea of how maybe he should spend his day, but most of us know that is not ever possible. So the next writer in the unit is Patrick Henry. We're going to read his speech at the Virginia Convention, known for his Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death conclusion. It's a rational document. It's one in which he disagrees with the men who have spoken with him up to that point, but in a very polite way stands up and says that if he doesn't contradict what they say and follow his conscience, that he would be guilty of treason, and he needs to make sure that everyone knows that now is the time to act. After that, we're going to study a very short 4-stanza poem, and it's taken from an anonymous broadside. It's called The Bold Americans, and in that piece we're going to see people who, the point of view of people who wanted to compromise with the British still, and didn't really want complete independence, and we'll talk about more of that when the time comes. Our next work is from a chief of the United Tribes. His name is Deconawida. It's probably the oldest document in our textbook. Deconawida was the chief of the United Tribes, who were made up of the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and eventually the Tuscarora. And in the work, we're going to see a lot of parallels between the Iroquois Constitution and our own constitutional documents, because our forefathers used that document in order to draft our own. And we're going to read about the Tree of the Great Peace, and we're going to read about the eagle that is atop it, and the long leaves and the long branches and the long roots that go out to others, and the fire that is below it, and that sends out smoke signals to let everybody know that we are a peaceful nation. The next piece we're going to read is from Thomas Jefferson. It is the Declaration of Independence, which reads like a math problem. It opens up with, "This is the way things are supposed to be. We have God-given rights that cannot be taken away from anyone. If they are taken away, then people have a right to revolt against others. We've been treated poorly, that this is the way we've been treated, and so therefore we have no choice except for to declare our independence." And the Declaration of Independence wasn't written for us. It was written for the rest of the world in order to tell them why it was that we needed to free ourselves of British rule. The next piece, called American Crisis, was written by Thomas Paine. Has one of the most famous opening lines in our section that we're reading. "These are the times that try men's souls." When Thomas Paine wrote this, George Washington, it is said, read these words to his troops before they crossed over on the Delaware to lead them into battle, because it was a good inspirational piece. And he writes about the summer soldiers and the sunshine patriots and people who aren't really participating in the fight, and how it cheapens their personal values or their personal worth, and that everybody should take arms and fight and do what we need to do, join our brothers that are already in the battle. And the last is To His Excellency General George Washington. It was written by Phyllis Wheatley, and it's not a hugely innovative poem, but it's something we should take note of because so few women were writing at the time, or at least so few women's works are found in our canon. And so we want to look at her work as a woman, and plus as a black woman, that had a different point of view perhaps. And so that kind of sums up everything that we're going to do for this unit. I hope that if you have any questions, you'll ask me, and that you'll refer back to this video in order to answer any questions you might have later. Have a lovely day. Bye.